So we are very pleased to have today with us in our Bar-Ilan University Vision Science Seminar, Professor Isabel Gauthier from Vanderbilt University. Professor Gauthier did her BA in psychology at the University of Quebec in Montreal. She then did a PhD in psychology at Yale, where her thesis, under the supervision of Professor Mike Tarr, was about dissecting face recognition, the role of expertise, and level of categorization in object recognition. She then did a postdoc at Yale in the Department of Diagnostic Radiology with Professor John Gore, and also at MIT in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences with Professor Nancy Kanwisher. Following her postdoc, she joined the faculty of Vanderbilt University. Today, she's a professor of psychology, a professor of radiology and radiological sciences, and the David C. Wilson Chair of Psychology. She's the head of the Object Perception Lab at Vanderbilt University's Department of Psychology, where her lab investigates how humans learn to categorize, recognize, and represent objects in different domains with a focus on acquisition of perceptual expertise and on the structure of abilities supporting both single object recognition and ensemble perception. Her lab also studies how individual differences in domain general object recognition are influenced by long-term experience, and also how these relate to episodic memory or statistical learning. These are achieved by employing a variety of techniques as fMRI, ERPs, and behavioral training studies using novel objects, as for example, the greebles, which many of us probably know. During her career, Professor Gauthier received multiple distinguished awards and honors, including the Mid-Career Award from the Psychonomic Society, the David Teller Award from the Visual Sciences Society, the APA Distinguished Scientific Award for Early Career Contribution to Psychology in the area of behavioral and cognitive neuroscience, and many more. She has served on multiple editorial boards on distinguished scientific journals, including being the editor of JEP General, and is now on her second term as the editor of JEP Human Perception and Performance. She has an H index of 75 according to Google Scholar and published more than 175 peer-reviewed papers, many of them in top leading journals. She also published over a dozen book chapters. Her work is highly cited and with more than 28,000 citations, and many of her papers have hundreds and even thousands of citations. She's given numerous invited talks across the world and hundreds of presentations in scientific conferences in the field, including in SFN, VSS, Economics, and HBM. On a personal note, I first came to know her work in the year of 2000 when she published her highly influential paper in J Cognitive Neuroscience, where she described for the first time a new region sensitive to faces, the occipital face area, also termed the OFA. Well, there's so much more to say about Professor Gauthier's achievements. I'd like to stop here and welcome you, Isabel, to our seminar to hear about your exciting research. And thanks so much for joining us today to share your science with us. So welcome.
Thank you, Sharon. That was a very generous introduction, and I'm so glad we made the technical stuff work. If there's a problem while I'm talking, I don't know, wave your hands or do something. This is different, and as I said, it's still early here. I took off all of my jokes because I can't really see you or hear you laugh. And so this is going to be hopefully not too long. But I hope that we have some time for questions at the end. So let me just jump in. So, okay. I just want to acknowledge some of the people who helped with the work that I'm going to talk about today. There are actually other people in my lab that are not listed here, and they probably should be. But as we all know, you don't do this work alone. And I'm going to try to put their faces on the various slides when they are leading the studies. So the work I want to talk to you about today addresses the general question of whether there's an ability to learn visual skills, a general ability, meaning one that, let's say, if you are the best person to learn to identify birds, you might also be, because the ability is general, the best person to learn how to match fingerprints, right? So general to different domains. And when I say visual skills, I really kind of mean high-level vision, complex object recognition, maybe scenes, although I won't touch on seen perception too much today, but we also look at that sometimes. And when we started doing this work, it was clear that there were more intuitions than research regarding these questions of individual differences in object recognition. Individual differences was just not something that was studied a whole lot in high-level vision. And there were many misconceptions. I just want to mention a few right now that, as we did this work, it became evident that people were kind of assuming, sometimes we even asked lay people to tell us what they thought about this. And in general, folks think that there's not that much variability in the normal population in object recognition, whereas in fact, when we measure it, we tend to see that there's as much as you find for other cognitive skills. People often volunteer, oh, I'm bad at this, I'm good at this. They think you can tell how good you are relative to other people, and you really can't. I mean, it's true for a lot of abilities, but I think it's even more true for perceptual abilities. We don't have, good access to other people's perceptual abilities, so it's hard to place ourselves relative to others. But the one misconception I really want to challenge today is that visual skills really depend mostly on training. So that, if you are smart and motivated and you get the right kind of training, you should be able to, do really well in any kind of object recognition task. And what we found, and this was obvious in some of my earlier work on perceptual expertise when we train people in the lab with novel objects, is that some people learn much faster, much better than others from training, even though, everything that we provided them was the same. And so we were interested in these questions. So I'll tell you some things we have learned about domain general abilities in object recognition. I'll talk about one study on neural correlates, and I'll apply this as we do. We apply it to several different domains. The one I will use today to kind of give an example of how we get into the more specific things that this is helping us understand is AI face recognition. So to take a step back, when we started looking at individual differences in object recognition, the first thing we had to do is to create measures, because there really weren't appropriate measures to study these abilities. So we created in 2012 the Vanderbilt expertise test. This was a test that is very similar to what you might know as the Cambridge face memory test, like in format, but it was created to study the ability to recognize many different kinds of objects. And so we had one for cars, and we had one for planes and motorcycles and birds and so on. But each of them has the same exact format. So on this task, at first, you see 6 items from a category. So for example, 6 motorcycles. And then you get a bunch of trials where you see 6 images, and one of these, sorry, not 6, 3 images. And one of these 3 is one of the 6 that you have studied, but it's the exact same image. It's very easy. It's just image recognition. So you get feedback on these trials. You do this a couple of times. You get good at this, and then eventually you get transfer images. So you get 3 images. One of these 3 is one of the 6 that you have studied, but from a different viewpoint with a different background, and that's a lot harder. So for example, on the planes task, you might study these 6 planes. You never have to name them or know anything about them. You're just studying them. And then you might get an easy trial where you have to judge which of these 3 is one that you've seen before. In this case, it's number 1. And then you get some transfer trials where you have to say which of these 3 is one that you've seen before. In this case, it's number 3. But the trials get harder as you go. And so we're able to measure quite a bit of variability in how good people are at doing this. And so just to pause here and make a note, this was quite different for me in terms of the kind of work that I had been doing before. When you study individual differences, you spend more time in what I would call measurement world, like you're developing, honing measures, making sure that they have good psychometric properties. That is really critical, especially in a new area, right? Like there weren't tests on this. It's a little bit, I like to tell people, like, imagine you have all these questions you want to ask about intelligence, but there are no IQ tests. And so you have to start there, right? Like you have to measure it before you can ask anything about how it relates to other things and what it can explain. And this is a challenge when you come from, when you have trained as a cognitive psychologist, because many of the tasks that we use that are very robust in terms of capturing a group effect, let's say the Stroop task, you don't need a whole lot of subjects to get a very robust, strong Stroop effect. They do not produce reliable individual differences. You really have to create your measures differently in order to do this well. And for those of you who already study individual differences, this might not be a surprise, but for me, it was kind of really something that we had to learn to get better at. Okay, so when we started using the Vanderbilt expertise test, the very first thing that we looked at were pairwise correlations. So those are the pairwise correlations for, I think it's 150, maybe more subjects, I forget. And so what you see is a range of pairwise correlations. The average of these is actually, it's about 0.33. So this one, the correlation between the ability to recognize motorcycles and mushrooms, is typical. And, it's only an R square of 11. So it's about, 10% shared variance, not a whole lot. So that's one thing that we noticed. We also noticed that there was quite a range, right? So you might find a fairly robust correlation for the ability to recognize cars and planes, but not so much between cars and leaves. And obviously, this may come from experience, right? So we're interested in a basic fundamental domain general ability here, or that's the question that I'm asking. But, the reason some people may be good at planes and cars may be that the people who are interested in planes are also interested in cars, and they have, more experience with both domains, and that boosts their experience, their performance. The other thing that was a problem with this approach is that all of these measures are all using the same task format. So I described what the format was, and then we, use the same format for all of these different categories. And you may think that's a good idea, but it also has presents a challenge, which is that it can inflate these correlations because of shared method variance, right? There might be aspects of this task that recruit something that's different from object recognition just because of the format of the task, and that's not really what we're interested in. So because of that, we learned from other fields who study individual differences and decided to switch to a different approach. So if we are interested in domain general object recognition, the first thing we would do for any single domain is to measure the ability, let's say, to recognize butterflies using different tasks, right? So the shared variance between performance on different tasks that use butterflies, but the specifics of the task formats, let's say the reliance on long-term memory, working memory, different aspects of the task are very different, so that what we measure is specific to this category. And then we can do that for several categories, and we can bring it together and say, what is common in the middle here, like the shared variance between the ability for these different categories, regardless of the tasks. So this approach is called in many fields a latent variables approach. In our first, I would say, serious attempt to study a domain general ability, we switched to this approach. We, again, wanted to use several object categories because we're looking for something general, but we also now understand that we want it to be general over different tasks. And we switched from using familiar objects to novel objects because of this problem that I mentioned, which is that with familiar objects, you have this kind of challenge of experience that can be correlated across different categories and that can inflate the performance across different, different pairwise correlations. So in this first study, we used novel objects that we had around in the lab. Greebles were mentioned. These are actually closest to the original greebles because they're symmetrical. So we have symmetrical greebles, asymmetrical greebles. We have these objects that are more tool-like that we call ziggurans. And then these more kind of bug-like creatures. And so imagine that there are, hundreds of exemplars in each of these categories. And one reason why we use these different objects is that we want them to vary on different dimensions, right? Like some are symmetrical, some are more animate-like, more tool-like, and those are all properties that, in high-level vision, especially in cognitive neuroscience, have been considered very important to organize mechanisms. So you'll find research in high-level vision that emphasizes category specificity, right? So parts of the brain for different things that look different, right? That look animate, that are small or big, that are curvy, symmetrical or not. All of these things are important. And so here we really want to ask, what about something that's general to any of that? And so at least, even though we're using novel objects, we're trying to push the boundary a little bit and have objects that vary on these dimensions. We also have different tasks. So in this first study, we used tasks that we had used in the past and that we knew were reliable. The first one is the same format as the Vanderbilt expertise test that I just described to you. So on the test for a category, you study 6 objects, and then for the entire test, you have to remember only these 6 exemplars. So you get a trial and you have to say which of these 3 is one of the 6 that you've studied before, and it gets harder and they change in viewpoint. In an object matching task, you only have to judge differences between pairs of objects. So each trial now is independent. So you see an image briefly, a mask, another image from a different viewpoint, and you have to say if they're the same or not. Then you start from scratch with another object for the next trial. And in what we call part matching, you're doing, again, a matching, but here of the top or the bottom of an object. So you see an object that's made out of the top and the bottom of 2 different greebles in this case. Then you see a mask, and then you see a cue telling you whether you are to judge the top or the bottom. So in this case, it was just the top. And you have to ignore, the bottom may be different, but you're supposed to say same here. And so this is a task that we have used in other work to measure holistic processing. And I won't tell the story of what happened, because we had some of these categories were trained and we were finding holistic processing. It doesn't actually change anything to the story that I'm going to tell you today. It's just another task to measure ability with these objects. So the point is that, ideally you want a large number of tasks and you want them to vary in many, many ways. We were just getting started. Now we have a lot more tasks, a bigger repertoire of tools that we can use. At the time, those were like the 3 that we trusted to be reliable enough, but they vary in different ways so that we're not, measuring only one thing across all of these. In this particular study, we recruited 246 adults in the Vanderbilt community. And each of them, because there was some training involved, which, as I mentioned, I won't really go into the details of that because it didn't change individual differences. But this was like 13 hours of testing for each of these subjects. So it was a lot of data. And to us, that was like our first, it was a big change from the kind of work that we were doing before. It was kind of our commitment, like if we're going to do individual differences, we're going to do it seriously and get the sample sizes that's pretty minimal for the kind of work that we wanted to do. So I won't go into all of the details of this work because I want to get to newer work, but this was the first time that we used this approach compare different models using structural equation modeling. So if you're not used to looking at these sorts of diagrams, I'm going to just briefly orient you. The tasks that the only observed data that we have in a graph like this are the squares. So let's say for the yellow category, we have like the learning task and a matching task and the part matching task. So those are the observed variables. The little circles at the bottom and up there next to the different categories, those are error variance. So that's there's always measurement error in any task, and anything that is not shared between these three tasks, the shared variance, represents the ability for a given category. What is not shared goes into the error variance. And then one advantage of using structural equation modeling is that you can compare many different kinds of models and see which one fits the data best. I'm showing you the model that we found the strongest support for, which is a model where at the top we have a higher level ability that we called O for object recognition, which accounts for almost, it's like 89% of the variance for each of the individual categories, right? So an ability that is, or support that is consistent for an ability that is general across these different tasks and these different categories. And so that was, the first time that this question had even been asked, and we were pretty excited about finding this. As I said, we compared different models. We looked, for example, whether there was more similarity between, like, let's say, the different Greeble categories or the different tool-like categories. None of that was showing up. Like, all of the data was most that would fit the best by a model that just considered all of these categories in the same way, even though I think one of them had received training, so many hours of training before being tested, and people were processing it holistically, like they usually do faces, and there was no holistic processing for the other categories, but that did not change the structure of the individual differences. So very robust general effect here. Okay, so just to recap what I've told you, when we look at pairwise correlations, right, I've told you, well, on average, we find about 11% shared variance. And when we use this other approach with structural equation modeling, we seem to get 89% shared variance. So that might be confusing to some of you. Why the difference? Well, there are several reasons why the two approaches can give us different answers. One of them is that when you use SEM, the factors that you're then correlating are not attenuated by what we call construct irrelevant variance. So that's the stuff that's outside, these central regions. Like the specific variance for each of the tasks is not what we're interested in, and so that gets absorbed by measurement error in the model. And so we can really ask of the variance that is shared across tasks for each categories, what is then, how is that related across these different categories? And then so you find something that's cleaner there. But another difference between the two studies, obviously, is that we use novel objects in the second study. And that eliminates variability that can be due to experience and kind of complicates things a little bit. So in the next study, we decided to replicate our measurement of O with these three categories of novel objects. And we also decided to compare it to familiar objects. In this particular case, we chose planes and birds and transformer robots. So there's probably not enough time for me to explain why we chose the categories that we chose. But they, differ, again, on many different dimensions. So we have objects that are animate or not. We have objects that are small or not, and objects that are man-made or not. Oh, that is my dog who wants to come in here. Give me a second. I'm going to let my dog in because she's going to whine the whole time otherwise. Sorry. Okay. So when we measured O with novel objects and with familiar objects, we replicated the fact that about, again, 89% of the variance across these different categories for, in this case, 2 different tasks was shared. And we found the same thing for familiar categories, but at the, what we call at the latent level, these 2 factors, so O novel objects, O familiar objects, were essentially the same. They were perfectly correlated. So this was very nice. This was kind of confirming that what we're measuring here with novel objects applies to familiar objects. Now, it's easier, in general, it's easier to measure with novel objects than familiar objects. And one reason why it's working well here is that we pick categories where experience is unlikely to be that related. So it's not like if you have a lot of interest and experience with planes, it's probably not that correlated with your interest with birds. And so as long as that the experience is not related, even if it varies, it doesn't cause too much of a problem here. Okay, I told you since then, so this is from a study in 2024, we have created many other tasks that help us measure O. And we've tried to make them more efficient. So this is from a study where 3 tasks that together take about 15 minutes give us a robust O at time 1, and then we can measure it again a month later, and at the latent level, the ability is, basically stable, like 90.94 correlation between these 2 latent variables. So a good test-retest of these measures. Now, before I continue, I want to, just make this disclaimer. We give this higher order factor a name, like we call it O. But just like G, right, it is a statistical construct. And we understand that it is consistent with a domain general ability that accounts for performance across different tasks and categories. But, what it begs for is a new research program to better measure it, to better define it, to better explain disability. And so that's really what this work got us started on doing. And so I don't, it leads to many questions, and I don't have all the answers yet, but we have a whole lot of fun exploring it and trying to figure out what this means and how useful it can be. Now, of course, one important question is how you place something like O in that big, vast literature on other individual differences, which, include things like visual processing. Of course, some of this is often measured more as spatial abilities than visual abilities, like with subordinate level tasks like ours. So recently, my graduate student, Connor Smithson, who just graduated, kind of did a survey of how new this O construct can be considered in the context of the literature on all of these other abilities. And just to summarize, what he found there's some aspects that are shared with constructs that already exist. So as I mentioned, visual processing, when you actually look at the way it's measured, it's often more of a kind of spatial ability construct with tasks that are more like mental rotation and such. And we have done some empirical work showing that what we're measuring is not mental rotation. It doesn't, it's not fully explained by that. It has some overlap with tasks that measure things like perceptual speed. although these tend to be fairly simple judgments where you just have to find the same exact image, the distractors are not that similar, and it focuses on fast, rapid responses, whereas we don't measure reaction times in our tasks. Sometimes, and I'll discuss this a bit in a sec. We have limited presentation time, but not always. It's not critical for the measurement of O. And there's also a construct of visual memory that's been, measured with several tasks where, again, the distractors are not that visually similar, right? So memory can be an aspect of the testing of O. And it's that stuff when I talk about, like, we have different kinds of tasks and we're interested in what's common across all these different object recognition tasks. These things may be part and parcels of the specific aspects of the task, not so much what's common. But we wanted to empirically study this a little better. And so in Connor's dissertation, he decided to do a study where we would compare two different ways of measuring O. So what we're going to have here is work with novel objects measuring O with what we're calling for short perceptual tasks, meaning that these are 4 tasks where what is made difficult, like the errors that we're forcing people to make, are because of limitations either in the presentation time, which is brief, or noise and stuff like that, right? So one example is this tree AFC matching, where you see an object very briefly, it's masked, and you have to choose which one of these 3 is the same. Another example would be the silhouette matching, where you see a novel object, and then you're looking at it simultaneously, and you have to pick which of these 3, which can be rotated a little bit, matches the top one. And then we also have 4 O memory tasks that place a bigger, kind of like force errors through challenges in terms of the number of objects that need to be held in memory, and also kind of sometimes a delay in testing. So in the new object task, you start with studying 3 objects, and then on each trial, you're asked to pick which is the new one that you haven't studied, that you haven't seen before. So on these trials, it's pretty easy. I think it's this one and then it's this one, but it could be any of them. And eventually, it could be one that you only have seen once, like 10 trials ago. So it really gets quite difficult. And then, that format that I've shown you before, the format from the Vanderbilt expertise test, really is more of a memory task, because you have to carry these 6 objects with you for the duration, of all of the trials on the task. So we measure O with 4 different tasks for each of these components. We also have in this study measures of low-level vision, general intelligence, and working memory. So for low-level vision, we have kind of these oddball trials where you have to pick which of the 3 is different, and it's different on one single visual dimension, right? So it could be the angle of the size of the angle, or the distance between 2 dots, or the size of a circle. And then the G tasks are, things that you've seen before, the ravens, matrices, vocabulary testing, a classic number series where you have to complete the series. And then we also have working memory tests. So the operation span, where you're doing math, like additions, and you're also remembering letters at the same time, and then binding between sets of letters and numbers. So we measure all of this, and we are interested in the fact that these measures are loading onto each of their constructs, but we're also interested in the correlations between them. So O perception and memory are strongly correlated. There's also strong correlations between those cognitive abilities and low-level vision. None of this is surprising given the existing literature. Now I'm removing all the tasks to just show you the relationship between all of this, which is quite interesting, and as predicted, if any set of results was very nice, this one really made us very happy when we saw it. So let me break this down. O perception, right, gets a significant contribution from both G and low-level vision, but not working memory, right? So those are the aspects of the task when we measure O with these kinds of perceptual tasks. We get a contributions from these. G also contributes to O memory, not surprising, but now we get a significant contribution from working memory, not from low-level vision. So we really truly created two different sets of tasks that measure O in different ways. And then what's left, the residuals, after you basically regress everything out, is those are strongly correlated. So evidence that what we're measuring in each task is never pure. You never get a pure measure of any construct, and that includes O. But there is something in common that is not explained by any of these different abilities. So that's the full model. We compared it to lots of different things and lots of different competing models. I don't have time to go into this, but this model fit the data really well. So, so far I have kind of talked about O as an ability to discriminate between objects at the subordinate level, which applies to different object categories. And if I was to amend that a little bit, or to try to have a more precise definition, I would say that what I believe now is that people with a high O may automatically encode complex objects more precisely and along more dimensions when they see them, regardless of the task that you give them. And I'll explain why I believe that. And having these more complex and precise representations will then facilitate various kinds of decisions that you may have to make about these objects, regardless of the way that you measure it. So one reason why or maybe the best reason, the strongest reason why I think about it this way, comes from an fMRI study where we went back to this sample, this population we had tested in where we measured O with novel and familiar objects, and we selected 35 of these people varying on quite a bit of range of O, some from very low O to very high O, and they were people who were willing to come back in the scanner. So in the scanner, we use a test that is quite simple and has been used in a lot of studies before. It is an fMRI adaptation task where on any trial, people are simply, they're doing an incidental task. So they're detecting just whether there's a size change in the object that they're looking at during a block. But we have blocks where we have the same object repeating over and over again. Now, it might vary a little bit in its orientation, and we have them all filtered so that the low-level visual properties are equated, but it's the same object. And in other blocks, we have an alternation between two different objects, right? But it's not relevant to your task. You're just wondering if, just detecting whether something's getting bigger. Now, these pairs of objects that could be different, they varied quite a bit. So some of them were very similar. Some of them were more different, right? So we have a range of similarity. And this is important. We talk about this as a neurometrically sensitive measure in the same way that to study individual differences behaviorally, we had to learn to create measures differently in order to be sensitive to the full range of abilities. The same thing was important in the scanner. We wanted to have pairs of objects that were so similar that only people with a very high O would perceive them as different. And so this would help us to discriminate between someone who has a super high O versus a really high O, right? And then we also have objects that are very dissimilar, so dissimilar that only someone with a very low O would perceive them as being the same, right? So we really wanted a range of discriminability here. Now, on a task like this, this is an example, of one region. I think this might be the LOC. It doesn't really matter because most visual areas do the same here. This is the duration of the stimulation when we show these objects varying, either they alternate or not. If they are repeating, you tend to see a habituating and adaptation of the signal, right? So the brain area gets bored because it's the same object over and over again. If they are alternating, you don't see that. And so this is the difference here, the neural sensitivity to shape, which we expect will vary across people and across brain areas. And we're asking where they are most related. So to make a long story short, we analyzed this in a couple of different ways. One of the ways was we had functional localizers in every individual. So each of these colored area is, so this is an inflated brain on its back, and each of these little areas in one particular subject is a region that is selected because it is, the peak of selectivity for, let's say, this is the EBA. So this is the body area. And then we have the FFA, right? So anterior and posterior, and so on, the place areas here. So all of these have been selected for their category selectivity. And all of the ones that I'm showing in a square around it are showing a significant correlation with O. So in one of these graphs, the x-axis is O as measured, several weeks before. It's actually several months before, outside of the scanner using our behavioral tests. And then on the y-axis is that sensitivity to these differences in shape that we're measuring in the scanner. And we can see many of these areas showing a correlation. In fact, when we do a PCA on this, we find that there's a big dominant factor that is common across all of these different areas that is related to O, right? So a signal that is quite distributed across different visual areas. We also measured it in large regions of interest, and all of these are areas where there is a correlation with O. And one thing that was really interesting is that the pattern of responses, so areas that in our study were more correlated with O behaviorally, that was very similar to work that had been done before, looking at kind of the best features for object recognition. So this is a study on the minimally recognizable features. So you have an original image, and then this feature that is degraded can still be recognized as this bird. This is just a little too degraded and cannot be by most subjects. And what you see is that the comparison of these features to these slightly more degraded features leads to a number of brain areas that are similar to what we find with O, meaning, I guess it makes some sense that the people who are the best at object recognition would be relying on the areas that are the best, that hold the features that are more useful for these kinds of tasks. But what is most important to kind of the claim that I made a few slides ago is that all of this, this relationship between behavioral O and the response in the brain happens in a task where the difference in shape is completely incidental. They're not trying to recognize these objects. They're not trying to detect differences, and we still find that the people with a higher O have a higher sensitivity to shape. So to sum up, so far, we have used a latent variable approach that has been used, in lots of fields, clearly intelligence, personality, some face recognition research. And it suggests a domain general ability for object recognition. It is one that seems to be relevant both to novel and familiar objects. it is a stable trait. We find that to some degree it is distinct from intelligence, working memory, low-level visual processing speed, and we've looked at other things too. Like, as I said, these are all things that can be very important to performance in any of our tasks. But what we define as O doesn't seem to be explained by any of these independently. And it is related to sensitivity to shape across many areas in the visual cortex. We did ask whether this is a strictly visual ability. I'm kind of going to go fast on this one because I want to get to the last part of my talk and not keep you busy too long. But we have done research where we have measured O visually, as I've just described, but we've also measured O haptically, where people do a number of decisions on objects that they've never seen, they're not looking at. And we can measure how good they are at this. And we find at the latent level a pretty strong correlation, not complete, but a pretty strong correlation between O visual and haptic. We have also created measures of auditory object recognition, which is challenging and a little bit of its own topic. But we have tasks that are psychometrically sensitive, that measure how good you are at learning bird songs or matching the person that is laughing across different kind of episodes, or the sound of keyboard switches. That those of you who are into gaming may know that different keyboards make different sounds. And so we have stimuli where you have to guess whether it's the same keyboard or not. And when you look at what is common across all of this, you measure an auditory O, which would be here. And then we have our visual O, that the way that I've mentioned before. In this particular study, we also had working memory and general intelligence. And after we regress out these other things, we find a really strong relationship between O measured visually and auditorily. In this first study, we have since then, studied this relationship again because we thought this was so strong, it was unlikely to be quite as strong, when we replicated it. So this is another study where here we have visual O, we have auditory O, and then we have spatial ability. So that's the G visual that you see in classical work, where you have measures of mental rotation with 3D, 2D rotation, paper folding. So you get a factor from this. And then we also regress out general intelligence at the top with Raven's matrices and reasoning and so forth. And to make a long story short, after you regress out general intelligence, what you find is that so you do not find a correlation between the mental rotation, like the spatial abilities, and O visual anymore. That correlation exists when you don't regress out general intelligence. So it is entirely carried by general intelligence. But what you do find is a correlation between O visual and O auditory. It is not 0.9, it's 0.6. And so probably the answer lies, somewhere between the two. You have to do a lot of these studies in order to kind of get a good estimate of what these relationships are. But again, not strictly visual. And again, this is surprising because, there's a whole lot more in common between our spatial measures and our visual measures. These should be switched. Then between the visual and auditory. Okay. So the last part of my talk is about the fact that we use these domain general, this domain general ability and actually other ones that we're interested in recently, like scene recognition, in order to explore what happens when people get a lot of experience or become really good or try to learn a new task in a specific domain. So, how does O help you get good at learning to make, medical decisions, like finding a tumor in a chest X-ray or deciding if white blood cells are cancerous. Or we've done studies on whether O is related to musical notation perception or food recognition. Those are all domains in which, if you're able to kind of measure and control for what is domain general, you're better positioned to study what is happening specifically, right? The example that I want to use today is a new one that we have been, we just published this work in JP General. And it is the task, the difficult task of deciding whether a face is AI generated or real. It's a task that we didn't have to worry about several years ago. And now it's, you know, we hear about it all the time, and it's very difficult. So we created a test where on each trial, you have an AI face and a real face. You have to pick which one is real. I know some of you have probably figured out which ones, or think that they figured out which ones are reals. The green ones are real, right? So some of these trials are easier than others. Some are really difficult. And it's been well documented by others that people are pretty bad at this. But we wanted to create a measure that was, again, sensitive to individual differences. That's our most important criterion, is we want something that psychometrically we can use. And in the first study so this is the AI phase detection test, right? So it's at the bottom here, AIF, and it is indicated by 4 different blocks of trials, right? So it's all the same kind of task. It really is, there's not several tasks here, it's one task. And we're measuring disability. And what we wanted to know was whether O, measured by, you know, again, those novel object tasks that I've described before, would compare in predicting disability to face recognition. So we have here the Cambridge face memory task, and we have the Vanderbilt face matching task. So 2 tasks with faces that are reliable, that you know, measure how good people are at recognizing faces. And what we see is, well, this is 250 people, by the way. We find a strong correlation between O and F, but only O is a significant predictor of how good you are at recognizing, deciding whether a face is AI or not. There's a different way of modeling this. This is not really a competing model. It's just a different way where instead of modeling the correlation between O and F, we basically say, well, F is just one of several object categories. So we can have O explain the variance that is common between the two. There's actually nothing left for faces when we do this in this data set. So it's pretty extreme. But again, when we model it this way, O is the only predictor of these AI face judgments. So that was pretty surprising. You know, again, because we're trying to predict something with faces, and another task with faces is not the best predictor. The best predictor is something that's general, right, across any kind of subordinate level judgment. We also did a second study where, you know, same AI phase detection test that we're trying to predict. We have O, but now we have general intelligence, and there's going to be, you know, G explaining some of the variance in all of our tasks, and then O only on some of the tasks. And what we see here is that O is the only predictor of AI face detection. So O is both better than a more specific task, face recognition, and it's also better than a more general task. We have replicated this with multimodal LLM faces. So the faces that I've shown you before, these guys here, those were the first generation of transformer like StyleGAN Model 1 faces. You know, recently in the last year or so, you can give your face to ChatGPT and it can create other faces that are other versions of your face in different settings or similar faces. What we created are, say, this face of this black man at the top. I don't know if you can see my arrow here, but it is created by giving it a real image of a person and asking for a front view of a similar but different identity person. So we've created a large set of stimuli. The images themselves come from a large data set that is quite varied and is very low quality. It's like a 2011 image data set. I think it's taken by, pretty sure it's taken by webcams. So we wanted, and we asked the model to generate images that were of similar low quality. So very different from the first study, but the task is the same. Which of these two is a real face? And what we find is that, so this is multiple regression. It's not structural equation modeling. We didn't bother with this time. When we, once we regress out age and gender and general intelligence, we find that O was a significant predictor of this task again. So it's general to, different kinds of AI faces. And so O in this case is just right? Like G is too high level, F is too specific to face recognition, and O is kind of right there in the middle, useful at predicting this complex tasks. But these, this is going to be, I think, my last empirical slide. These studies with AI faces have led us to kind of learn a little more about what it is that people with a high O are doing differently. So in a recent study, we used the same data set, image set that I've just described to you, and we matched on each trial a real face with a face that is closely matched. So it is like another identity, but same hairstyle, same race, same gender, and so there's no very limited other dimensions than just the quality of the image, maybe. And what we found when we used this more difficult task is that on average, so this is accuracy on this task, right? Which face is real? Some people are really good at picking the real face. Some people are kind of in the middle, but most people are doing this thing that has been described before by others, which is a hyper-realistic kind of judgment. They think that the AI face, this one, that the AI faces look more real than the real faces. And what is interesting is that this behavior relates to O. So if you think about this, doing really well at the extreme in the blue category or the red category is the same kind of absolute D prime. Like you're equally good at discriminating the two kinds of faces, but in one case you're picking the real face as real, and the other case you're picking the AI face as real. This could be just a kind of the flip of the coin at the beginning of the task, and you stick with that. But that is not the case. What we find is that those people, so this is cumulative accuracy over the 50 trials in the task, and we find that the people who are in this better than chance, we eventually get it right on average, have a higher O than those who reverse the judgment. And what you're seeing is that those who are using the reverse judgment, they kind of settle into this behavior really quick, and it doesn't change throughout the trials. Whereas there is, so here I'm showing you the learning rate, right? On the y-axis, I'm showing you the learning rate between trial 10 and 50, and it is predicted by O. And this is O residuals because, again, we're controlling for age and gender. And so what you're seeing is evidence that people with a higher O slowly throughout this task are kind of learning the features that help them make the correct judgment, right? There is a learning process, and this is not what's happening for the other guys, even though they may have as high discriminability. So over a series of studies, we're looking at the possibility that low O individuals tend to tap into one obvious dimension in any task that they're doing, right? So they don't have as rich and precise a representation. So they use whatever is obvious, and then they stick with it, right? And in this particular AI task, this leads them to make these hyper-realistic judgment. Whereas the high O individuals, possibly because they have these richer, more precise representations, are able to learn more subtle cues over time, maybe cues that vary from one trial to another, and can learn the correct assignments. So I'm done. I just want to summarize the fact that some of the work that I've mentioned are studies on the structure and validity of O as a domain general ability, right? So we do a lot of these like big SEM studies to kind of compare and place O to other abilities and try to figure out how best to measure it and how it relates to other things. But we also have a set of studies where we use O to understand how people perform, how they learn in specific domains, right? And it's been useful and applies to a lot of different domains, which really is, theoretically what a domain general ability like O should be good at, right? It should be relevant in the real world when you're trying to learn or become an expert at something else. And so there's a lot of this ongoing work in the lab. And I'm going to thank you. Not too late, and I'll take any questions that you have.
Isabel, thank you so much for such an interesting talk. And I want to ask everybody to unmute yourself and to let's give Isabel a big applause for the great talk. And also, Jeremy said that's very cool, and he had to run, so he wrote that in the chat. And so, if you're happy to take questions, then
sure, absolutely. I'm glad I got through this. It was a lot. As I said, it was early, so
yeah.
And it's so much harder when you don't have people and like you can look at someone like, do you understand? Do I have to say it a different way? So sorry about anything that was unclear. I'm happy to answer questions.
No, it was really great. So I actually have a question. I mean, I see no hands raised yet. I want to ask if you tried to ask people how they perform the task, just inquire like what do they do, for example, in the face task or when they have to study, or sometimes people don't know to actually verbalize and report what they actually do, but maybe it could provide some insights into, what people, I mean, I assume I'm going to be on the on the
You
worst,
can't tell.
on the
You
non
can't tell. Don't
picking.
assume.
Yeah. I don't think I'm good at that at all. But I'm wondering
Yeah.
what people who are successful in this are doing to, yeah, but in any of these tasks to try to tap into what this is actually measuring. I mean, in a way, it looks like some kind of mid-level visual processes that nobody actually knows. So it's all these mid-level visual processes that nobody really knows where they actually take place and when they actually take place and if they're sequential or so. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a really good question, Sharon. And so sometimes we do, like in the latest AI studies, when we saw people make these, very let's see, these extreme, opposite judgments, right? So we have people with the same D prime who can do it right, like pick the right one or pick the opposite one. And so we went back and asked them, like, can you tell us how you did this? And we see differences. It's not like they're they'll the people who get it right will mention things like imperfections being associated with real faces. The people who do it the other way said that the real faces, so for them it's the AI faces, are more alive looking, lifelike. They call the other ones more zombie like, which is people say things and it can be systematic sometimes. In this particular study, it seemed to be different between those two categories. The problem I have with asking people and making a whole lot out of it is that if you were following what I've shown you in any one task, a lot of the performance is going to be accounted by other things than O, right? So you're going to have your general intelligence, your working memory, other things, your verbal ability that are going to contribute to what you are doing and also the way you talk about it. And it's hard to pin down, just what is related to. Oh, we have a different, for any of you are going to go to VSS, I'm going to present on, or my students going to present on a new line of research where we're actually asking something about about language, which is, do people with a high O describe images differently than people with a low O? So you just show them an image, complex scene, take it away, and you say, just write, 200 words. And what we find is that they do it differently, and you can tell from language. There's lots of different things we're finding. It's fascinating. So I'm not saying, you can't use descriptions but I think asking them what they're doing in the task, it can be a little bit misleading, especially since we've shown, like in the imaging study, that you can measure O when people are not even doing anything, and their visual system is sensitive to these visual differences, and it tracks O. So
yeah, I was thinking of patient literature, but yeah, you're absolutely right. So if you're happy to take more questions, so Neve and then wait. Because
Hi, thank you. It was super interesting. So I have a question, two-part question. One part is kind of related to what Sharon just asked, and the other is kind of more general. So the first part is, do people differ, people with high differ in their confidence, or did you measure confidence in any of the tasks? Because do they have like a different subjective feeling of their performance, or are they more accurate or more in line with their performance?
Don't
okay.
wait for the other question. I can only handle one at a time. We do, in all of these different AI studies, we measured confidence only once at the end. Like, we asked them, how confident are you? Because there's no feedback during this test. So they do the whole, like, say 50 trials, and then we say, how confident are you that you were able to find the AI, the real face? And there's quite a range, and it's not predicted by O. It is sometimes related to G. I don't know why, but it's not related to O. So, and it is, I think, I would have to check, because this is really new data here, but I believe in this study where we find the most hyperrealism, confidence is related to absolute D prime. So, if you fold this function and you have people who are equally good, but they flip the judgment. So people who tell you they're very confident in this particular case, they know they're systematically following a signal. They're separating the two categories, that they can tell you. But it doesn't predict who's going to learn to do it right. So
interesting, thanks. And then the other part is perhaps related more to the work you didn't talk about today. How does that come about in other tasks? So I'm a social cognitive neuroscientist. So I was wondering whether you think O should predict other behaviors that are more prevalent in the social domain. So discriminating different emotional expressions, or subtle emotional expressions, or subtle behavioral changes. And does O, or do you have work in that domain that's showing that O can affect there as well?
Thank you for the question. I think that, when you use visual stimuli, perceptual stimuli, including voices, right? Or, image, faces, people, to study, you're interested in social behaviors. It's a little bit like what I'm doing here, which is that you're interested in the social part, but some of the performance is visual, right? Or perceptual. And so to that extent, if your task is hard enough, right? Mm-hmm. The judgments are difficult enough, then I would expect that O would account for some of the variance. It doesn't mean that it explains the social variance, you know what I mean? Yeah, that's all I have to say about it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Merit?
Hi, beautiful talk. And the AI results are really amazing. And you actually answered my question, the question I was going to ask, if they receive feedback, and you said they don't.
They don't so we had one study. I can at least show you the stimuli. The study that Connor did with these white blood cells, where it was a categorization task or category learning task. On each trial, you got 3 of these, and you have to learn to pick like which one is cancerous. And we measured O, and we want to know, whether O predicted how good you were at learning this. And we compared, in one experiment, he compared with feedback and with no feedback in the category learning task. And what we found in this particular case is that O predicted performance only when there was feedback. And I think there was a specific reason for this. I should clarify, I don't think I said this, but in most of our tasks, we tend to use the same order of trials, for all participants, because we don't want order to explain any of the individual differences. Now, this limits some of the other inferences we can make. But in this particular experiment, and in many of our tasks, the trials might be ordered from easiest to hardest because it tends to encourage people to keep trying when you do that. And it can happen in a task like that if without feedback, you can get stuck in what seems to work in the easy trial. So in this case, the size of the cells was somewhat diagnostic with which one was cancerous. But as they got more and more difficult, it wasn't anymore. And without the feedback, people kind of get stuck in that bad rule. Whereas with feedback, they learn. The people with a high O learn more, right? So I'm not saying feedback cannot be relevant. It depends on the situation that you're setting up. Sometimes
So what do you think they're actually?
cases,
But you're showing a learning curve, right, in the AI phases.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
Even though there's no feedback, I know.
So they're generating some inner hypothesis and they're reinforcing it, or what do you think is happening there?
I'm not sure yet. This is the most recent study I have, so I'm not done thinking about it.
Yeah, this is really interesting.
I will say that in the first one, like this one, right, where we measured, where we again found that O was predictive of performance. We had a lot of subjects because for the same task over 2 experiments, we had 500 subjects worth of data for these trials. And so we did a complicated item analysis comparing how people with low O versus high O, which cues they were using. And what we found was that basically the low O people use cues that are very useful on the easiest trials, but they use them across the board. They're gonna get stuck on obvious trials, so on obvious cues. So it might be like the smoothness of the skin, or whether there's problem with the hair. But they do this for all the trials. Whereas the high O people, again without feedback, seem to use cues more flexibly, across trials, because not the same in this particular task, there's a lot that's varying in the images, and it's the stuff in the background, stuff in the hair, stuff in the glasses, right? There's a lot of cues on a given pair that can be helpful. And the people with a high O seem to find that, which is why I'm saying it makes sense to me that to start with, they have a richer encoding. It's more precise, it's richer, they have more dimensions. And then they can solve any kind of visual task better because there's more, there's more to work with. So that makes sense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. Thank you.
I actually want to add that I think it would be really interesting to actually use feedback and see if the O is a predictor of the learning curve, like what Nurit suggested, or in what you said, because I don't know, but it could be interesting. Maybe not.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the fact that it is predictive of learning without feedback is most fascinating, right? So this result there, and we would have to change things in the design in order to study learning with feedback better. But this is certainly something that we should do. As I said, there's more questions than answers at this point. So.
Isabel, I want to thank you again for joining us. This is such a fascinating talk, and there's so much more to think about, and clearly still an enigma. But thank you so much for sharing your science with us, or part of it at least, and for joining us. It was a pleasure having you. And again, I want to thank you again for this wonderful talk. And next week, we will have Maayan, who is a postdoc in Niv Regeslav, who's just been asking the question. She will talk about cultural influences on face perception from a new face data set that they've created. And Isabel, I also want to say that Jeremy, he said he had to run, but it's a very cool talk. And you have many additional great talk, very interesting. Thank you
Yeah,
very much.
I see the
Yeah,
chat.
you see
If
the
anyone
chat.
has, specific questions or they're interested in using any of our measures, feel free to contact me. We're really keen on having other people help us answer all these questions that are coming up. So
Okay, that would be great. So I hope maybe even we will contact you.
very good, very good. Get in touch. Thank you
Yes,
for
thank you.
thank you for
Thank you
this
so
chance
much.
to talk to you guys.
It was great having you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.